Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. With the provincial election looming, some parties that are getting some candidates nominated, and we're talking to one of those candidates today. He's been on the show before. We're going to talk about some of the stuff that we talked about when he was on last time, but we're going to get more in depth into it, including who he is and why he's running for the Green Party of Alberta. Regan, thank you so much for coming back to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
So let's start with before we get into the whys and the hows and the RSTARs and all of the other stuffs. Who is Regan Boychuk?
I was born and raised in Alberta. I grew up in Grand Prairie, about 5 hours northwest of Edmonton. But I've been in Calgary for almost 30 years. I've went to school. I'm a political scientist. I have a master's degree and did some of that work with the University of Alberta at the Parkland Institute, where I was a research manager. And I started studying royalties and profits in Alberta's oil and gas industry. I'd worked on the rigs in Otter Brooks during the summer when I was going to university, and just had an interest in an industry that is obviously so important in Alberta. So I've just been studying it in my free time for the last 15 years. And I work as a roofer, have a family, but have put tens of thousands of hours into studying these issues over the years. And that has led me to brief various ministries, to work at the Parkland. I was on the oil sands expert group during the last royalty review, briefed the Auditor General around these issues. And the reason, well, the strange thing is that no one else is studying these topics. As a political scientist looking at Alberta, obviously these are really important, and there's no one else doing it. And there still isn't anyone else studying these issues. And I'm convinced they're critically important to understanding Alberta and salvaging a livable future. But they're not on the agenda, they're not debated. And I remain committed to trying to raise these issues. And that's been a central focus of my work with the rural community over the last 6 or 7 years around issues of oil field cleanup. And it's been incredibly frustrating to watch for 15 years as all these issues get worse and worse. And everything is moving in the wrong directions. Royalties were already the lowest in the world, and they just keep getting lower and lower. 15 years, they've only gone lower. And so that it's been an effort to study, to understand the place I live, grew up, and it's been a surprisingly lonely endeavor that there aren't more people more concerned about trillions of dollars slipping through our fingers.
So let's talk about that for a quick second, just because we might have some people who are listening who aren't familiar to how sort of what royalties are and how royalties work. So when you say royalties are going down, what are royalties and why is that bad?
Well, royalties, the easiest way to understand them is what they aren't. They're not a tax. It is what owners get paid for their resource. So when the money Tim Hortons pays for its coffee beans, we don't consider that a tax. They're just paying the owners of those beans for that. And a royalty is the same thing. That oil and gas and bitumen belongs almost entirely to the citizens of Alberta. And a royalty is what is the owner's share. It's what we get. And Lougheed in the 70s, he had a target. He wanted to collect 35 cents of every dollar as royalties for the owners, 1/3. And the developer will get 2/3. You can debate about how overly generous that was, but that was his objective. He was in office for 14 years. He collected exactly 35 cents a dollar in royalties for the owners. And that's what built this province. We were swimming in money, built the hospitals, paved the roads, etc. And that 35 cents is eroded down to the target was only 20 cents under Klein, but he never met that. And it's gone down and down under the NDP government. It was around 5 cents a dollar. We're giving away 95 cents of every dollar to industry for our resources. And so it's not a tax. It's not something we give away because companies are struggling. if they can't afford to pay royalties, they can't afford to be in business, and they should be left there for someone who can produce them profitably. And so that owner's share is critically important. Alberta is different than a lot of other places in the world, than the US. They're crown resources. They belong to the citizens. They're developed on our behalf. The regulators and the Department of Energy are the stewards of trillions of dollars of natural resources. And I'm just foolish and naive enough to believe that we should get a fair share of what we own. We should collect all of the excess profit. It costs a certain amount to develop it. There's certain investment involved. That should all be repaid. Everyone, and they deserve a profit on that. But after a normal rate of profit, there's a lot of extra money left in Alberta. And almost all of it goes to industry today inappropriately. And so just last year, in 2022, after the industry paid its corporate taxes and its royalties, they put $152 billion in their pocket for shareholders that are mostly foreign. And so we did get a lot of royalties last year. For the first time, a long time, we didn't have a deficit, but it's still a pittance compared to what we give private industry. And I know these issues aren't debated much, and and so I think the easiest way to think about it is an analogy about home ownership and real estate agents. Your home, everyone understands, a big valuable asset, and oil and gas is much the same. It's a valuable asset under the ground. We can't maybe do renovations ourselves or sell our own house. We need a real estate agent, and they have skills and costs, and we cover all those, and we give them a profit. But when he sells your house, the question Albertans should ask themselves is, how much of the home equity does your real estate agent entitled to? Should he get 50 cents of every dollar of equity in your house for his services? Because in Alberta, especially in the oil sands, we give 95 cents of our home equity of the oil sands to the real estate agents. The guy doesn't own it. And that's the problem. And it's really hard to believe how bad royalties are in Alberta. We're the lowest in the world. It's really hard to rationalize how low, you could only collect 5 cents a dollar. And I've struggled to make sense of this for 15 years, because ever since Ralph Klein, they've only gone down a dozen times, and we get broker and broker. And it's the sole reason the province has had deficits since 2000, royalty cuts in 2010. It is owners giving away our wealth to a mostly foreign-owned industry is the root of our troubles here in Alberta. And the amount of money coming out of the ground, there's just no excuse for it. There's more than enough go around. It's just long past time someone acted like we actually owned this stuff.
I guess the obvious question that I have to ask is, you were saying that under Lougheed it was 35 cents on the dollar that Albertans got to keep. Why has it gone down by like 700% to 5 cents on the dollar now?
Well, there's an incredible influence of industry on the Alberta government. I can assure you of one thing: it has nothing to do with the facts. I've been studying these issues for 15 years. I was very involved in the 2007 royalty review, and ever since, I've been studying this for 15 years. And I have never read, except for the 2007 royalty review, I've never read any report by a think tank or a bank about royalties or profits that wasn't a fraud, that didn't fake data, that wasn't absolutely ridiculous if you just paid attention to it. And there's a reason, because you can't justify lowering those royalties over and over and over. The numbers don't add up. It has to be a fraud. And I was involved in the 2015 royalty review. I was on the oil sands expert group, sitting in a room of 15 oil sands executives. And they never even considered the oil sands in the 2015 royalty review. The sum total of analysis was, and you guys have a problem with the oil sands regime? Anyone? Moving on. That's 3-4 million barrels a day of production in Alberta that's criminally profitable. And that's how much analysis we got of it during the last royalty review. It's really hard to understand I don't have smoking gun documents or whistleblowers to tell you the whole story, but I can assure you it has nothing to do with the facts or the economics. The numbers don't add up. Alberta's really lucky. Canada is extremely lucky. We have really good industry statistics. We know how much all this costs them. And so we know how much profit they make from their own statistics. And this is what I published with the Parkland Institute back in 2010. It's never been questioned. It's bulletproof. And it tells a much different story of industry. The oil sands are incredibly profitable, and the regulated industry is tired, unprofitable, insolvent, with enormous urgent cleanup needs, and they're not being addressed by the government, by the opposition, by the bureaucracy, by the regulator, and we're getting pretty late in the game. The costs are mounting for landowners and rural municipalities, and unlike the election of 2015, there isn't on offer a review of the Alberta Energy Regulator. There isn't on offer a royalty review. Those aren't even on the table this time. And they're more urgent than they were in 2015. None of those issues have been addressed. None of those problems have lessened. They've only grown. We've only wasted all of those years. And yet Albertans still aren't offered an alternative of common sense, fair share of what we own. And so even though I'm a political scientist and paid a lot of attention to these issues, I never wanted or imagined to run for office. But despite all of my efforts to try to build up awareness or opposition from everything that already existed, have come to naught so far. And I was very pleased to meet the new Green Party in Alberta and its leader, Jordan Wilkie, who invited me to take part. And as a political scientist who studies this cesspool, it's really nice to be involved with genuine people. Policies are centered around common sense and basic decency that should have a pretty wide appeal. And this issue of royalties, there hasn't been a public opinion poll in Alberta about royalties since 2010, for very good reason. There's absolutely overwhelming support for dramatically higher royalties, but nobody's offering it. We're broke. We can't do anything. But no one is offering to raise such low royalties. And for that reason, the Green Party is the only place that would have a whistleblower like myself pushing these issues that obviously aren't welcome in the debate, but remain incredibly important to Albertans. And so I remain committed to trying to raise them one way or the other, because I know if Albertans knew that everyone else knew what's really going on, how much money is on the table, and how different things could be if we raised ourselves to the level of Sarah Palin's Alaska, or if we had royalties as high as Texas, Alberta would be a dramatically different place. But we're also running out of time to realize that. We can stand around and watch and it will all slip away. And there's only a few years of valuable, profitable production left. And we don't have another election cycle to keep watching it go away.
All right. Well, I got to say, it's pretty wild to be talking with a Green Party candidate who's advocating for oil and gas. So what was it about? I mean, like there's a couple other parties that are kicking around. Why the Green Party? Why the Green Party in particular?
The Green Party is the only one that would have a whistleblower like myself who wants to raise these issues that are unwelcome. They recognize the importance of them, the justice of them. And I worked with the NDP party for many years. I was working closely with a number of cabinet ministers before they were elected, after they were elected. I worked with the Rural Caucus for years, all over the province, worked with surface rights groups all across the province. But they won't raise these issues. The NDP lowered royalties further in February 2016. And then in July of that year, they announced 2 more royalty subsidy programs. We enjoyed deficits ever since. They won't say a word about royalties. I've been advocating on the cleanup issue since before they were elected the last time, had access to the Premier's office all throughout their first term. They won't say a word about it. I think they tried some things behind the scenes in 2016, but they didn't work out, and they've abandoned them. They don't have a solution to offer for rural municipalities that are out $500 million in unpaid oil patch taxes. They're not advocating for the cleanup that could put those riggers back to work all across the province. The Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project that I worked with for the last couple of years, last summer, put out a job report analyzing all the different wells in Alberta, mapping them all, and how much labor and spending would go into cleaning them up. And it could result in 10,000 jobs a year, easily, at no cost to the public if the polluter paid. And so my analysis of Alberta is that our royalties are too low and we don't make the polluter pay. And if we don't fix those 2 things, none of the other issues matter. If we let this money slip away, the rest is I should give up. We're not going to be able to solve these other problems. But if we were able to act like owners, collect all the excess profits, we would have had $152 billion extra last year. How much of that could we put in the bank? Who could we have taken care of? What could we have cleaned up? That's what's available this year. The law for polluter pay is on our side, but it's simply not honored. It's not enforced. It's not upheld. And royalties, Cabinet can change those with an order in council by lunch. Again, the next day, we can fine tune them, raise them on the first day of office, and have a fair share of our resources. They're coming out of the ground. Whether we can spend it all in a year or not is no different. It makes no difference. We should collect all of the excess profits so that we can clean up the mess, pay reparations for what we've taken, take care of the people that have been injured, and clean up this mess. And Alberta is extremely lucky. I don't know if there's other jurisdictions, Texas, no hope. There's no money. There isn't enough profit left to fund the cleanup of how much there is. And Alberta does have a really big problem. A lot of mess is accumulated, but there's $152 billion of excess profit coming out of the ground these days. Those big bills could be wiped out in a couple of years without taking anything from anyone, without any new corporate taxes, any new income taxes, by simply collecting those excess profits for the owners like we deserve. Alberta could be a dramatically different place. We could solve, and if we collected the royalties, the rest would just be politics. We could sort out all of that stuff. We could come to terms, whatever the consensus across Alberta was. I'm perfectly confident the reasonable terms we could come to on all sorts of issues and make some dramatic progress. And the other thing that the Green Party offers that none of the other parties do is a real commitment to proportional representation. And that's really the only way we could defend any of this progress. If the NDP had been more bold and made more progress in their first term, it would have been reversed just as dramatically when Kenny replaced them 4 years later. It's only with finally delivering proportional representation so we can have a fair representative government that we could defend any progress we made. And so that those higher royalties would be guarded into the future. In Norway, their $1 trillion fund is universal pension for everyone, invests everybody in their future. They guard it like as they would their pension, as opposed to here in Alberta, the total is about where it was in the 80s without adjusting it for inflation. We simply haven't saved. We have given it away. The scale of it is flabbergasting. We've given away we've been robbed of trillions of dollars. We have about that much left to be robbed of still, and then they're going to leave the mess for us unless we smarten up. We can. Lougheed did it in the 70s. He immediately quadrupled royalties, passed all sorts of laws. The first reclamation, the cleanup didn't exist before Lougheed. put in, the laws are all there. There's a remedy to every problem we face. The problem is, since Klein, those laws aren't enforced. The regulator is a law unto itself. We can't get these rules enforced. And now we can't even get a political opposition to raise these issues. And so we've been struggling on these issues forever. And I finally had to take matters into my own hands and run for office in the hopes of trying to raise these issues that I know strike to the heart of a huge majority of Albertans, and it's the root of our woes. You notice how during low prices, everything was Rachel Notley's fault. Under high prices, everyone's suffering is Justin Trudeau's fault. That's just ridiculous. Our problem is we're collecting 5 cents of every dollar. That's our struggles. We fix that, the rest disappear. The deficits disappear. We can actually talk about what we want to do, because that's the problem we've been reduced to in Alberta. We have another election where nothing is being proposed, nothing is being offered. We have Trump's sister destroying this place as quickly as she can, and all that's being offered is to stop the bleeding. We will stop that. We won't do that. We will reverse that. They're not offering us anything better. And that kind of seems to be the game. We're going to go through another election where we're not being offered anything better. And things are pretty bad as it is today. We have a recession coming pretty soon. Things are going to get tougher. And I don't want to be here under a UCP, under Danielle Smith, when things get rough. I want to be in a place where we're in charge and we can get our fair cut of the hundreds of billions of dollars that are coming out of the ground. And after that, I think most of our other problems will solve themselves.
Okay. Now, you talked a bit about the cleanup costs. You talked a bit about how we're going to get left with the mess. We talk, and we've had a little bit of this conversation before, but I want to revisit it because I think it's really important. One of the big reasons that we had you on the show last time was to talk about a program called RSTAR. Now, this is a program that has been proposed, rejected, proposed again, rejected, proposed again, and maybe is undergoing a little bit of a rebranding, but it sounds like it's going to be the same thing. So for anybody who didn't catch that episode, what is RSTAR and why is Danielle Smith wrong?
The RSTAR is a program that will use royalty subsidies to clean up the worst old wells from the worst shale companies. It is not hard to imagine why the Alberta energy bureaucracy rejected it a number of times, but it has been a priority of Danielle Smith for a year and a half. And since the last time I was on, I can offer some more details about the RSTAR program. It came to life last summer when the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project that I work with put out our jobs report in June 2021. The first phone call I got and the first interview offered to us was from Danielle Smith. And Dr. Swan, the former leader of the Liberal opposition and a board member of the ALDP, him and I met with Danielle Smith and her sidekick, Chris Kinnear, kind of the lead on this RSTAR subsidy pilot project they're offering. And Danielle Smith said something amazing in that meeting. She told me that she had been personally tasked by Premier Jason Kenney to respond to the ALDP's job report. And she wanted to meet with us about RSTAR. And we wanted to meet with her to tell her how stupid it was, how it was a ridiculous giveaway. It didn't even pass the laugh test. So she told us that she had been personally tasked by Jason Kenney to respond to that jobs report, after which she became a lobbyist for RSTAR. And we've learned since that back in June, Sonia Savage, the energy minister under Jason Kenney's UCP government, formally rejected RSTAR. We have a letter to the Freeholders Association on official letterhead from Savage saying the RSTAR pilot has been rejected. Less than 2 weeks later, Danielle Smith's chatting to me about a photo op with the energy minister at the old well on my grandpa's farm that was highlighted in the ALDP's job report. And she was later offered me a spot in the RSTAR pilot that has officially been rejected. But Danielle Smith, tasked by the Premier, is offering me a spot. I took that as a bribe, trying to buy me off. And I told them I wasn't interested in jumping ahead in line and getting my well cleaned up, trying to solve this problem. Didn't hear any more about her much until she became the Premier. She became the leader of the UCP, but we knew as early as July of this summer the details of the RSTAR program. And it's just scandalous. And we knew that Peter Guthrie, the current energy minister under Smith, and Chris Kinnear and Danielle Smith were lobbying vigorously all throughout the year on this. We got a leaked letter in September that authored by Danielle Smith that says the energy minister has approved the RSTAR pilot, which had been officially rejected. And so what this points to is collusion between the former Premier, the former energy minister, current environment minister, and Danielle Smith over the RSTAR program. And my friends and I have been trying to raise the alarm about the RSTAR program since at least July of this summer. We haven't been able to get any media's attention. I know the breakdown doesn't count as journalists, and so you've been happy to chat, but there's been extremely little coverage, no real coverage of this leaked letter. And Danielle Smith brought up the RSTAR program in media interviews the day she was sworn in. She brought it up at her first press conference after she was sworn in. It's in the energy minister's mandate letter. It is a screaming priority of the Premier, but been unable to get the media or the political opposition to raise this issue. She has a couple of pilot projects she's proposing, using their numbers, could be $2 billion in royalties that we give to the worst of the worst companies, shell companies, the worst wells. It's unbelievable, but it's moving ahead, chugging along, and we know that they have consultations with landowners scheduled in Calgary February 9th. My groups haven't been invited. I haven't to those consultations about the RSTAR program, but despite the silence, it continues to move ahead. And so what we had for oil and gas regulation in Alberta, the pillars that would have protected taxpayers were dismantled by Kenny. There was kind of 4 pillars. One of them never worked, but 3 of them were dismantled by Kenny. And this RSTAR program he's handed to Danielle Smith, this is kind of the ultimate nail in the coffin. Once they've taken away all the programs that Alberta regulators developed for us in the 80s and 90s, those were all dismantled under Kenny, and it's going to be replaced with RSTAR. And this precedent is using royalty money for cleanup. That's just the beginning of the end. We're going to start giving our 5 cents a dollar back so they can clean up the worst hidden old garbage. It would be hard to believe, except it keeps moving along. And that's another one of the reasons why I'm running for the Greens. They're the only ones who will raise this issue. And I believe it's urgent and critical that it be stopped, but not just stopped, and not just barely stopped at the last second. It should have never got off the ground in July. Danielle Smith could be stopped with this knowledge. She would have never become the leader. She would have never won the by-election, etc. This can't be all we get of it is stopping RSTAR. It needs to be stopped, and then we need fair royalties.
So, I mean, I think one of the reasons why, because we spent almost an hour and a half in our last conversation, and we spent a little bit of time here. I think one of the reasons why it's maybe had some difficulties getting some coverage with media is that it sounds very complicated, because the first thing they have to understand is what royalties are, and the fact that royalties are what the people of Alberta get for letting oil companies take oil and gas out of the ground and go make money off of it. Explain to me, like a 5-year-old, what is a royalty subsidy?
Well, they get a credit. It's like a tax credit instead of paying $1 billion in corporate tax, they pay $500 million, and they get to keep half. And so it's not like they're collecting taxes and giving it to the corporation. They just don't have to pay it in the first place. And so when the company takes the oil out of the ground, instead of paying all the royalties that would be due, they keep some of that in their pocket as a credit if they use it for cleanup. And there's also going to be a market, so they could trade these credits to other people who are still drilling, sort of thing. And so it's foregone revenue. It's instead of us getting paid, instead of them paying for the basic materials, our oil and gas, they get it for free in the hopes that they'll do it. But I think one of the most misleading parts about kind of some of the weak opposition to RSTAR is the assumption that's always repeated in these weak arguments that these companies are all legally obliged to do it. They're going to do it anyway, so we don't have to give them this money. I don't know where these people live. It's not being cleaned up. They don't have to. They don't. And I've documented and spoken constantly about a secret no look back deal that Alberta regulators made in January 1991, where they promised the industry, you can sell or give away your wells to whoever you want, and we'll never look backwards. So if it's a sucker with no money, sounds crazy. It's contrary to the law. It's contrary to the Getty cabinet that issued the environmental protection orders back then. It's contrary to accounting rules. It's contrary to banking policy back in the day, except it's true. The regulator has never stopped them from giving away old wells. And that's the root of the problem.
I just want to make sure I understand it correctly. So if I'm an oil company and I say, you know what, I'm gonna do the thing that I'm supposed to do, which is cleaning up the well, the hole that I dug in the ground to get the oil or the gas out. If I clean that up, then the next time that I start a project, instead of having to pay you, and I'm making up numbers here for just ease of understanding, instead of having to pay you 5 cents on the dollar for all of the oil and gas that I take out of the ground, I'm only going to have to pay you 4. Is that right?
Something like that. And it's not even that. You don't have to wait for your next project, because there's also going to be an open market. And so you can so even if you don't have any money to drill another project, you can immediately sell that credit and pocket the money, or use it for the cleanup. But that, even in your example, that's the misperception that they're not cleaning it up. They're not going to clean it up. They don't have to clean it up. That's why we have 300,000 unreclaimed wells in Alberta, and only 50,000 of them produce anything of significance. 250,000, 5 out of 6 are depleted or inactive already. And we have that many because they don't clean it up. And the law does say they should, and we all talk, but they don't. That's the problem. And so as bad as RSTAR is, it would actually put people back to work. We would be spending Albertans' taxpayers' money to do it, but it would be cleaning up things that would otherwise just be sitting there rusting. Danielle Smith talked in her first press conference as premier about these flare pits from the 60s. Well, that's not struggling junior companies today. That's the big old boys. And what is that still doing not cleaned up? Those guys had more money than God back then, still do. And why is this premier pushing a multi-billion-dollar subsidy program for flare pits from the 60s, from big oil back before we had regulation, if everyone has to clean it up and is doing it anyway, so we don't need to bother? And so we do need to force some cleanup. It's not happening. It's not going to happen. It is what the law says, but there's a lack of political will to enforce that. And nothing else is going to amount to much if we don't solve those problems. If we don't have democratic control of the regulator, if we're not collecting our fair share of royalties, we're not going to be able to solve all these challenges that are facing us. But if we do, we're the luckiest place on earth. We have trillions of dollars of resources. They're ours. We have a provincial bank that we can finance all of these projects. There's nothing Alberta couldn't do if we simply collected all the excess profits. And that doesn't take anything from anyone, doesn't tax anyone. We don't have to beat anybody in court. They can keep everything they have. They can keep the trillions. The last year's 152 billion. it's yours. But moving in the future, you're only going to get a normal return, a normal profit on your investment, and Alberta citizens are going to decide what to do with the rest. The law is on our side. Justice is on our side. If we can do that, Alberta has a bright future. Otherwise, it's inconceivable that we can deal with everyday life, let alone the big challenges coming down the pike.
You had two reports you wanted to talk about. Which one you want to talk about first, sir?
Jobs. So we get offered subsidies. Subsidies are always justified in jobs. And when Jason Kenney came in, he cut the corporate tax rate to great fanfare. And some of the most profitable companies in Alberta are the bitumen producers up in Fort McMurray. And the Parkland Institute put out a report, and they had a piece about it today where they looked at the four biggest oil sands producers, who together enjoy $4.3 billion in tax cuts from Jason Kenney. And they did an unusual thing. They followed up, because those tax cuts were sold by Imperial Oil board member Jack Mintz and Imperial Oil think tank economist Trevor Toome as going to offer Alberta 55,000 new jobs. That was the economic consensus. Good number. We do this, it's going to hurt, but we'll get it back. With 55,000 jobs, we'll make up more than that in tax revenue. And 3 years later, Parkland Institute looked at what we got for $4.3 million in tax cuts, and we got negative 3,500 jobs. So for every $1 million in subsidies, they laid someone off, and and so that's not unusual. That's pretty typical of subsidies to the oil patch. Subsidies are a reflection of the power of the oil patch, not the logic that jobs actually result from it. Because I've studied these issues back to the 90s when royalty cuts started to pick up, and they've never resulted in the promised jobs. And so it was nice to see Parkland underlining that issue as we head into another huge round of subsidies for bitumen producers with carbon capture and hydrogen and all sorts of other expensive fantasies, which a huge part of the reason bitumen producers want to pursue those technologies is because of the royalty regime in the oil sands. It's so generous. It covers all your costs with free oil. It gives you Albertans oil to pay for all of your costs. Your dump truck drivers that make six figures, they're paid with free oil. And so if you want to spend $30 billion on carbon capture, Albertans will pay for all of that with free oil. That is, if the industry wants to waste their money on those expensive, unproven technologies with their 10 cents of profit, that's one thing. But using Albertans' resource rent and the excess profits to fund that work is foolish. And if Albertans were in charge of all the excess profits coming out of the oil sands, they might find some better uses than unproven, expensive technologies like that. But unless the royalty regime is smartened up, all those fancy, expensive, unproven things will be paid for by you and me. That's why they're so keen. Industry does not spend money. They do not invest money here. They take our treasure out of the ground, and they get to keep a big chunk of that treasure. There's no real investment involved, but we can't keep doing that if we're going to fix this stuff.
So that's the Parkland paper that you wanted to talk about. What was the other one?
Bob Aska at Alberta Political Economy has done a valuable public service. This leaked letter we have from Danielle Smith from July 2021, a 5-page letter authored by her that lays out these subsidy programs, the RSTAR, in pretty significant detail. He's made all that text available and has an excellent analysis of it. He's a political scientist and economist. It's been at the University of Alberta, been involved with the Alberta Liabilities Disclosure Project. He covered the Redwater case quite closely. And so his analysis is right on point. And it says that it's hard to imagine so-called market advocates going to bat for the 400 worst licensees. It's nothing more than a corporate handout in his estimation. And that's been our analysis since July. But yet it keeps moving ahead and moving ahead. It's defies logic.
Where can people find? We actually had Dr. Aska on the show a while back when we were talking about a new book that he wrote, where he was having the thought experiment with a bunch of other writers and experts in regards to whether or not Alberta should consider a provincial sales tax. Where can people find this letter or the details?
It's Alberta Political Economy, I think, is the name of Bob Aska's blog. I think it comes out tomorrow, but it's up there now. I'll have to double check the name of his blog, but it's online there now. And because the text of it has been hard, hasn't quite been available. It was only on Facebook as JPEGs, and so he's put it all in an accessible format together with some analysis. And so it's the most significant analysis of RSTAR so far, and so quite welcome.
I got to point out, you still haven't told us where you're running, man.
Banff Kananaskis.
There we go. Why Banff Kananaskis?
It's where I live. I live in Redwood Meadows, a beautiful and unique community on a First Nations reserve here, just 20 minutes west of Calgary. And so it's a absolutely lovely place. We've been here 3 years, and so this is my riding, and so this is where I'm running.
Alberta Poly Econ, I think, is Dr. Aska's AB Paul Econ. ABP AbPolCon. I mean, we could do this a bunch of different ways, but yeah, it's abpaulecon.ca, and that's going to be published. We're recording this on January 30th, so it's going up on the 31st.
Yeah, it's up there now, but it's just dated tomorrow.
Okay, perfect. All right. Well, I want to say thank you so much, Regan, for coming back on the show again and having a conversation. It's fascinating. It's really quite fast. Alberta politics, man. The fact that I'm having a conversation with a Green Party candidate who's advocating for the oil and gas industry and responsible development of oil and gas. Crazy times we live in.
It's true, but common sense does seem pretty strange these days. But maybe it can come out on top.
There we go. Awesome. Well, thanks again, man.
Appreciate it.
As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here at The Breakdown, we would love it if you swung by our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab and signed up for a small monthly sponsorship of the work that we're trying to do here. It is because of the support that we receive from our Patreon sponsors that we're able to continually up our game, and it is tremendously appreciated. So I want to throw a big thank you out to them, and you can go ahead and visit that website and join and support us as well, because we need all the help we can get. Thank you so much for your attention. Thank you so much for listening and being part of these important conversations. And we will see you next time on The Breakdown.